Hello everyone, thanks for tuning into my video. Hope it's informative for you. It's going to start out a different way than I planned. This might be a lesson for everyone in some way or fashion. I'm actually going to take the AANP this morning. I'm not very confident. I may have scheduled it too soon. I spent 3 days really prepping. I'm legit worried at this point. No matter what happens, hopefully I'm in the right attitude. Because if something should happen, it's no one's fault but my own. What's up guys, hello everyone tuning into this video. I can only imagine you're searching and you found this video for the same reason I was looking for one about 2.5 years ago. I'm going to go over what it was like for me to do my family nurse practitioner through Chamberlain University, because oddly enough, this is the biggest family nurse practitioner school in the US. One of the oldest schools in the US. I had extreme difficulty finding any first-hand recollections of what the class was like. All I found were complaints on horribly sourced websites and general misinformation about what you would call degree mill schools, which I'll get into that later. I would have liked to had some guidance, some information on what to expect throughout this entire program. I had the same intentions when I made my immersion video roughly a year ago. So I'm hopeful that this will be informative for anyone watching. This video is mainly for someone who's considering Chamberlain, someone who's just finished their bachelor's degree and they're shopping for schools, or anyone who's already in Chamberlain and looking for what to expect. I'm going to do my best to break down each part of my entire experience, all 15 classes. I won't do each class individually, but I'm going to try to break up the sections into what to expect. My first point of this video is this is not to bash Chamberlain. You know, everyone can have their fair share of complaints and problems with their school. You may have heard plenty of people complain about Chamberlain or any school that they've gone to. I had things I liked about Chamberlain. There's things I also didn't like. The point of this video is to give as factual information as I possibly can, mixed with some of my own opinion, because I definitely have some, obviously. I'm going to try to break this video up into sections throughout the timeline, so if the introduction is not interesting to you, if you want to skip parts you've already done, I'm going to start off with the reason that I chose Chamberlain. My biggest decision at first was trying to decide between a CRNA school, nurse anesthetist, I hate that word, that's the only time you're going to hear me say it in this video, or nurse practitioner. So at the time I had primarily ER experience. I moved to the ICU after that, but at the time I only had ER experience. I was leaning more towards family nurse practitioner anyway. I know there's a wage gap. I think the median wage nationally for nurse practitioners is right at $100,000, and for a CRNA it's probably closer to 150 to 160K a year. Understand that's considerable, that's a decent amount of money, but I had to take into account a lot of other things. I did not want to quit work and do school only at the time. It wasn't something I was interested in. The girlfriend I was with at the time, who's my wife now, I did not want to put that strain on her. I didn't really feel like I had the personality to become a CRNA. I feel like you're kind of tied to the hospital. I'm sure I'll get plenty of comments saying there's different things you can do, but I felt like you're kind of tied to the hospital. I didn't like shift work. I didn't like the thought of being on call. I understand, hey, sure, you can work 2 24-hour shifts and have all your time off, but that kind of work just really wasn't my kind of thing. And I feel like I perform better in a job where I'm given some kind of authority and autonomy. I'm not saying CRNAs don't have autonomy. They probably have more in many cases, but I feel like being able to manage patients in a primary care or an acute care setting, or working directly for a cardiologist, something, anything like that, I felt like was better fit for me. So that's why I lean more towards nurse practitioner. As far as why I chose Chamberlain, throughout my 2-year degree program, Chamberlain was well known. It's one of the bigger nursing schools. I never heard the term degree mill schools like a for-profit school until I was well into my family nurse practitioner program. So that may be something you want to research. It's hard to find any biased opinions. Mostly the word degree mill is derogatory. It's used by, I'm not saying it's used by any group specifically, but it's typically a derogatory term you hear from those who feel that nurse practitioners who had no classroom time did not receive an appropriate education. At the time when I was in my 2-year program, Chamberlain had a good reputation as far as I understood. I'd never even heard of Walden or the other schools, and I knew WVU, which is where I got my bachelor's degree, and Marshall also offered FNP programs. So I chose Chamberlain for the biggest reasons because it was all online. I had already finished a bachelor's degree online and I felt more comfortable with it, and I felt like it was a better transition for me, and that way I could still work full time. For the most part, at the end, I didn't, because it would have been too much of a strain for me personally. A lot of people do it, but I didn't. I had the option not to, which I was very fortunate and very blessed to have that choice, but that's why I went forward. So when I began my research, Chamberlain was an attractive choice for me for the 8-week classes, which at the time just sounded good. I didn't even consider, you still have to have the same amount of information in that short period of time. But moving on, so I applied to Chamberlain, I was accepted. Another important thing about Chamberlain is that it's fully accredited. You can use your degree here and move on if you wanted to get a doctorate or any other kind of specialty. So as I said before, Chamberlain is the largest FNP program in the entire country, which I didn't even know that until I went to make this video. I know that when I did my immersion weekend, there were over 400 of us, and that was just one session. As far as the reputation of Chamberlain, I can't say anything about their curriculum. The Chamberlain pass rate for AANP and ANCC, the two, certifying boards for nurse practitioners combined, was over 90%, which is higher than the national average. So I'm going to break down the things I liked and the things I didn't like about Chamberlain, and maybe it'll help anyone watching decide if they want to continue or if it's something that they think they could handle. Because I can't say, I'm going to go over it more deeply at the end, but I cannot say it was a horrible experience. I don't think grad school is necessarily going to be a pleasant experience no matter what you do. But I felt like there were stressful times. I felt like it was very manageable. You begin Chamberlain with your NR classes. I think it's NR 500. You have NR 500 Foundational Concepts, NR 501, which is Theory of Advanced Practice. Then you have NR 512, which is Informatics, 506, which is Healthcare Policy, NR 510, which is Leaderships, and then NR 505, which is Advanced Research. The Advanced Research class was kind of annoying. If you remember your research class from your bachelor's degree, it was kind of similar, a lot of learn about randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, things like that. And it's no big surprise if you're going to do one of these programs and your paper writing skills are weak. I don't even think I have to tell you, if you just did your bachelor's degree, it's a lot of papers, APA, strict format papers. If you're good at those, you're going to have a lot more smooth experience moving on. After you get through these classes, you move on to me personally, what was kind of the turning point in the program is when we started epidemiology. Epidemiology was the first class, unless I'm mistaken, that I actually had a test in. Every single larger grade in all your other classes was a discussion or a research paper up until this point. Epidemiology was kind of the point where you're like, okay, now I'm actually having to start to learn something. And the only test we had was a final, which I did not do well on. I did enough to pass, but that's kind of the pattern you get into with Chamberlain. You have to keep your grades. The easier assignments, I don't like that word, but the more straightforward assignments that you actually have time to complete, you have to do well on those just in case you have trouble with testing or if you're just a bad test taker. After epidemiology finishes, you begin the real heavy lifting classes with pathophysiology, pharmacology, and assessment, in that order. Pathophysiology, really all three of these classes, if you think you're going to get in these classes and not read and study, then online programs aren't for you. If you need to sit in a classroom and have someone talk through PowerPoints and give you specific examples while you take notes, then maybe online school period is not for you, because a lot of these classes were self-taught. I don't like to use the word self-taught. You were assigned readings every week. There sometimes were short videos and PowerPoint, but there were no live lectures. Occasionally there were recorded lectures, I can't directly recall, but basically it's self-read and you have to learn. And then there were these intense case studies. I'm still talking about specifically pathophysiology. Intense case studies that got so in depth and you had to cover so much, and you just constantly, it was a good learning experience, but it was very time consuming. Afterwards, I realized I had garnered a lot of information just from doing that. The pattern kind of continues with when you start pharmacology. My class was taught by a PhD pharmacist. It's a lot of information to cram into 8 weeks. It may not have been the most comprehensive experience, but the case studies there were also very complex. It was one case study that was several different things that you had to actually use clinical practice guidelines. You had to use your book. You had to use several different resources to ensure that you were treating this patient right. But at the end, you realized you had looked up so much that you had to retain a lot of that information, and I feel like I did. And then the big class, one of the biggest transitions, after, I talked about the first 6 classes, then moving into these classes, you finally start getting tested. Assessment was one of the bigger changes. And assessment is where I personally had the biggest bump in the road, because you begin SOAP notes, and that word might sound weird to you if you haven't started the program yet, or if you're not familiar with the term at all, but SOAP notes. In assessment, you had a lot of the same things from the previous classes, pathophysiology and pharm, but you had virtual patients, and it might be different now. I know we had shadow health virtual patients, and we had to see them, do full documentation, and then write a complete SOAP note. And they give you a template, and the template was so buggy, it was horrible with Word. It wouldn't save right half the time, but it was really hard to do. The biggest reason it was hard to do is because there was little to no guidance whatsoever. It's one of my biggest pet peeves. I really struggled in this class because I think the first SOAP note we had to turn in was week 1, and I think it was a comprehensive assessment, and I think out of 75 points possible that week, I got about 22. So I struggled from then until that point. And the tests, there was a midterm in this class and a final, and they were so difficult. It was just off the wall stuff, and there was no lecturing. So it was an advanced physical assessment, and you had little to no guidance. Big knock on Chamberlain, which it may have come down to the instructor. It's possible. My instructor was great as far as contact, immediately answered me back, tried to help with everything. When I got to where I was doing bad in the class, she actually contacted me, set up a meeting, and wanted me to speak to her, which I did twice. I managed to survive the class, but it was a big eye-opener. Honestly, I should be thankful for it. This is also the class where you have your immersion experience, which I have a video about right here, but basically it's the first time you actually do anything in person. You actually fly to Chicago, assuming COVID-19 restrictions have gone for anyone who's watching this video. I think it might be live now. We were probably one of the last groups that got to go and do a normal experience before it moved on. But anyway, survived the class. Immersion wasn't that bad. You can find out more by watching that video. At this point is when we move on to the practicum courses. Before I actually start talking about the courses themselves, I need to talk about this entire experience, because if anyone has spoken to you and given you an idea of the biggest differences between what I'm going to call brick and mortar school and an online only school, this is probably it. So with Chamberlain and many other online only classes, you're going to be tasked with finding your own preceptors. And I had, relatively, comparably to others, not that much difficulty. I live in a more rural area, and it's not as competitive. I'm unsure why it was so much easier for me, and it's not like it was easy for me, but I had less difficulty than others I knew in my class. Keep in mind, these experiences are going to vary slightly, probably, because For 70% of my time doing my practicum courses, we were hit with COVID, so everything changed a lot. If you have friends that are mid-levels, or if you're acquainted with mid-levels who take students and are accepted by Chamberlain, they're going to tell you long before these classes start how to get the process started. Start it ASAP. Find them, fill out your practicum application, get them turned in, and keep in mind it doesn't have to be nurse practitioners. It can be MDs, it can be PAs, and you just can't be in a hospital. Get that done, as many as you possibly can, as early as possible, to keep yourself from having a headache, because just from what I've gathered from my classmates, it is a miserable experience. Some people had to sit out whole classes, whole semesters. These are probably the most nerve-wracking classes once you start them, because you're going to also have your didactic portion along with a clinical portion. Now, so the first class was called Differential Diagnosis, and basically what it was, board-like questions and helping you understand how to build a diagnosis just from the presentation of a patient. That's helpful when you start your clinical rotation. The next two classes are specialty classes. You'll do elderly and geriatrics, which is set up the same way. And then the next 8 weeks will be pediatrics, set up the exact same way. Every week you'll have assigned reading, you'll have assigned videos, you'll watch, and then it breaks down each pediatric session. The fourth class was NR 603, and it was clinical practice. It's more or less a continuation of the differential diagnosis class, where honestly you just broke down clinical practice. Pretty much the same questions. As far as the last class of this practicum course, there are 5 total practicum courses. Now, in my group, we graduated in October of 2020. There were piloting 2 different final courses. Part of my class took NR 667, but I took NR 661. They were largely similar. We had the same kind of review, but their portfolio assignment was slightly different than ours. So I don't know if that'll be changed for anyone in the future who might be watching this. This last class, NR 661, was probably one of the more helpful classes as far as actually preparing you for your boards. Weekly, you had APEA, which is an organization you're going to hear plenty of once you start your assessment class. Practice tests. You have access to videos from APEA, which are pretty informative. Usually each one is about an hour long. There's probably 20 of them, and they break down each subject, and they also give you some exam prep. The lady that teaches these, Amelie Allier, she really helps break this stuff down a lot better. So that's a breakdown. That's kind of a breakdown of the classes and how they go. I'm happy to answer any questions in the comments below, but I'm going to move on to what I like about Chamberlain, what I didn't like, and kind of my tips for how you can be successful. Pros for Chamberlain: 8-week courses. You don't commonly get many breaks, but 8-week courses fly by. Now, a lot of people probably wouldn't prefer that. Probably they'd prefer a more stretched out. Honestly, I felt like in the beginning, they were easier classes for sure. If you're going to double up at any time, if you're considering Chamberlain and you want to double up classes, the first 6 classes can probably be doubled up. Now, it'll be a lot of work, but there are no tests, and it's just a lot of paperwork. That's probably when I would have done it. But the one thing I like about Chamberlain is I'm not a very organized person, but it helped that almost, I can think of probably 3 or 4 occasions that it wasn't, but almost every week you have something due on Wednesday and everything else is due on Sunday. That's everything. So it helped you. I always knew, like, if I needed to ask off for work, or I always knew that, hey, this has to be done. I always knew Wednesday, I always knew I had something to do. And I liked that a lot. And that helped a lot with my scheduling, because I worked full-time for a long time. You're going to find a lot of different opinions with this, but honestly, student services with Chamberlain was great. I could call them, if they were busy, I'd have a callback number. They would call back almost immediately, and they always got me to the right place, or they always tried to help. So my battery died. Sorry for the pause, but moving on from student services. I personally have 0 complaints with student services. I know one example. When I was struggling in, I think it was 509, as via the assessment course. I actually received a phone call. I hadn't contacted them at all. They contacted me after one of their student service representatives had reviewed my grades. And he actually called to make sure I was on the right track. And he actually told me what my options were as far as worst case scenarios, dropping and moving forward. I was very fortunate to make it through that class, but it took a lot of hard work, and I could have definitely made it a lot easier on myself. So you hear me reiterate that a lot. If any tip I have for this course, probably any online degree course like this, is to stay ahead. Don't let yourself get behind like I did. I was very, very, very fortunate to come out ahead like I did. Another arguable point I might have, and people that were in class at this time may have a different opinion, but the response to COVID-19, I feel like Chamberlain did a pretty good job, because they're huge. You know, I can't imagine how many students they have in any given time, and they cut us down. We used to have 2 responses every week in the discussion, and they cut it down to 1, which a lot of people complained about. But for them to change so much so fast, and I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I'm sure they have to turn in some kind of lesson plan, or they have certain requirements they have to meet to be nationally accredited and to have our transcripts even mean anything going to the AANP and when we take our boards and everything. So they did that, and on a normal situation, your practicum, you're limited to 125 clinical hours per 8 weeks. You have to have a total of 625 at the end. They accommodated everyone pretty well. Once COVID got in full stream and they realized that, hey, it's difficult sometimes for these guys to even find a clinical spot, we got to where we could have as many clinical hours as we wanted coming through the last 3 to 4 classes. Don't quote me on that, I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure. And they also changed it to where we only had to have 500 face-to-face hours, meaning actually in clinical, and they offered us to finish the other 125 hours with shadow health, which I know that word might not mean anything to anyone right now, but it's basically patient simulations, like 3D patient simulations, and they allow each one of those cases probably took a couple hours to do, hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on the complexity, and you would get a full 10 hours for that. So that was helpful. That was a good thing that they did. I feel like they did more than they may have had to. I don't have any source on that, but I feel like they may have done more than they had to, but it was really helpful. There may be some more positive aspects. Those are definitely the high-ranking ones, the ones that I think of first and foremost. But moving on to what I didn't like about Chamberlain. I'll start with my biggest complaint about Chamberlain, and it's probably consistent with any online course, any online class, anywhere, is instructor parity. It blows the mind sometimes because there's no semblance of unity between how some teachers act versus others. I was very fortunate. Out of, I think, 15 classes, there were 2 instructors I had any kind of problem with. One was bad enough that I had to call the school, and I complained to student services, not on the instructor specifically. I had to call student services and report that I had concerns with an instructor. I did not like the way that this instructor went about grading assignments. It was very late in the program, and I would oftentimes be deducted more than 10% for APA errors. I would build a perfect case study. I would be deducted 11 out of 100 points for literally just APA formatting, and there'll be supporters on either sides of that argument, but I've been doing my APA formatting from the beginning. This is almost 2 years into the program, and all of a sudden there is, a problem with the way I'm doing it. I didn't agree with that, and my opinion is, at this point, I'm trying to learn how to be a provider, not an English teacher, so I didn't care too much for that. I didn't think it was important. I didn't think it was worth, because you gotta understand, those assignments in the middle, especially with Chamberlain, are very important. So it takes stress off the final and midterms. So I survived. That's all that matters. And I know there were more horror stories with a lot of my other classmates. Like I said, I had 2 times out of 15 classes I could have complained. And then my last 4 instructors were great. Had no problems there. Next biggest complaint is the clinical logging system. Now, to be fair, I'm not educated on how it's done in other schools. But the logging and the way hours are counted with Chamberlain are what needs to change more than anything. I understand there are going to be parity between instructors. There may be no way to fix that, but they could fix the clinical logging system. There are a plethora of problems. Number one is you are not awarded hours based on how much clinical time you've had. And if you don't understand that right away, meaning if I go to a clinical site and I spend 8 hours, but I only see 2 patients, I do not get 8 hours. You have to document time per patient. So if I see this person, I'm only allowed to document, and it changes throughout the course. So at the beginning, they'll allow you to document as high as 45 minutes, and it's another thing. Each instructor is different. Some of them will let you document as much as an hour for a primary care visit. But so towards the end, you couldn't not, depending on your instructor, you should be seeing 3 patients an hour. So that means 20 minutes. So you have to see 3 patients to equal 1 hour. Sometimes clinics, especially during the COVID season, were not that busy. It was difficult to get all the hours you needed. Sometimes you'd go 5 days during an entire week. You'd work 40 hours of clinic. You'd do 40 hours of clinical time, and you would see 25 hours worth of patients. And that was just, I don't know how other schools do it, but I feel like that's an atypical setup. And next I move on to the My Evaluation system, the most tedious, time-consuming facet of my entire master's education. Each patient took probably 5 minutes, which doesn't sound a lot, but when you saw 20 patients, if you don't have time to log as you go in your clinical site, it was miserable. The medications were set up wrong. It asked for just facts about these patients, and it was the most infuriating. It was the times I find myself the most frustrated towards the end was definitely when I was logging patients. So prepare yourself for that. Take it into deep consideration. It's a headache. I added this to the con list, but some people may prefer it, but there's little to no teacher interaction in the way of lecturing. I can't recall a time that any teacher lectured for any class. It's all self-taught. Self-taught might be a little black and white way of looking at it, but you were expected to read, take in the information yourself, and enough to pass the test at the end of the week. I remember a few classes would have a recorded lecture, but it was usually not by a teacher. It was just Chamberlain's video that every single class had, and it was from a few years ago. I personally didn't have that much of a problem with it. Even when I was in nursing school, I seldom paid attention in class, and I would go home and read it myself. If you don't learn that way, you might have to have a few things to consider with any online course. Those are my biggest cons, the biggest problems I had. Anything else would just be personal. It'd be just complaining just to complain. But those are, I think, the biggest problems with Chamberlain, and I would not be surprised in any way if other schools' online courses had the same exact problems. One thing I wish someone would have told me earlier that I'll say for this too, just a tip for success here. If it's the beginning of your master's education for Chamberlain, find the Facebook group. There should be a Facebook group with everyone who's in the same class number that you are, and I can't tell you how good of a resource it was just to have an interconnected network of people who were doing the same thing you were, because it was just helpful. You know, there were posts, you could get on there and post questions. Someone would have found something. It was a good way to, within academic integrity laws of Chamberlain, to operate. And if you don't have one yet, you should start one and add everyone to it. I mention the academic integrity because Chamberlain's a big school. I feel like there will definitely be eyeballs on that Facebook, whether it be private or not, that would get back to the school. Anytime we had a really good moderator in our Facebook group, and anytime anyone would try to break any kind of academic integrity laws, we busted that up really quick because it's going to hurt you in the long run. It's not a good thing. But maintaining academic integrity and having each other as a resource with the Facebook was great. I didn't get into it until almost the practicum courses. It was very useful. I'd recommend definitely finding it if you're already in Chamberlain, and stay ahead. As I've already mentioned, stay ahead. The smaller assignments, the papers, do really well on those so you don't put so much stress on you for the exams, because I passed most of those exams, but they were very difficult. And once you get towards the end, they're worth a lot more. They're worth as much as 200 points. They're worth as much as 20% of your grade. So definitely focus in on those. Just in conclusion, there's some things I definitely wanted to mention. If you're concerned about this, I've done a little bit of independent research. I found a few blogs where Chamberlain, Walden, Frontier, several of the other schools, and this is well after I'd already been halfway through my program, were designated as degree mill schools. I just want to give my opinion on that, if it helps anyone watching this. Degree mill schools, certain people who are already practicing, I've gathered, mainly this was a couple of Reddit threads, seem to think that it's insulting to their practice and profession that someone can get all their education online, pass their boards, and then practice alongside them. They think that Chamberlain was mentioned by name several times as a for-profit degree mill school. Now, I'm not buying into that. At first I may have, at my most frustrated moments I may have, but this school has proctored exams that you can't cheat on these tests. If anything, you have to work harder. Many people will have to work a lot harder because you have to learn this yourself. There's no way you're passing these classes without reading this stuff yourself. No one's going to say to me, I didn't learn the material, I didn't work. The tests are not open book. These tests are, there is a camera on you at all times. That's something to consider when you're going to this school. There is a camera on you at all times that has facial recognition technology, and if your eyes move left or right or down, the test turns off and tells you to reposition yourself because they are watching you, they are recording you, they're recording sounds. Before the test, you have to take your webcam and look at the entire room. Chamberlain offers you the opportunity to put the work in and do it. So I won't hear, there may be an edge for brick and mortar schools, but not everyone has the time. And from those I've talked to presently, most of the nurse practitioner students I know that have done brick and mortar schools recently have said that almost all their work could have been done online. So outside of the advantage of them finding your clinical sites, I'm not going to act like it's a gigantic advantage to avoid online courses. Yes, Chamberlain's for profit, but the last thing I'd say is, would I recommend Chamberlain to someone else? I think I've painted a pretty good picture. It is really going to depend on the person. I think it worked okay for me because it's largely it's pretty much how I would learn if it were in a school environment. Now, if you have difficulty teaching yourself, or if you don't like the thought of finding your own preceptors, or if the clinical logs sound terrible, or if you don't like the thought of not having direct teaching, like live teaching, maybe it's not for you. But I won't say that I didn't learn the material. I haven't taken my boards yet. Hopefully by the time this video is over, I'll show. But I feel ready. I just graduated a week ago, and I haven't even done my post-school review before I take my boards. But I feel prepared. A lot of my practicum experience taught me a lot too. I think based on all that that's how I would recommend it to others. It wasn't a bad experience. So I think that pretty much covers it. If anyone has any kind of questions, you can put them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. If you found this and you haven't started Chamberlain yet, I hope it was informative. Good luck.